Spy Cops Info Podcast, a series on the secret undercover political police who spied on over 1,000 campaign groups since 1968. Episode 12, The Lambert Report. Okay, so welcome to the Spy Cops Info Podcast. I'm Tom Fowler, and I'm joined with
Chris Bryan from the Undercover Research Group.
And
Jessica from the Undercover Research Group.
So today we're talking about the Lambert Report, which, to give it its proper name, is the discussion paper on SDS targeting strategy and deployment in relation to the Animal Liberation Front.
It has a very misleading title.
It is a bit, yeah.
There's absolutely nothing to do with that.
But it is authored by Bob Lambert.
Yes.
Which is the reason why we're calling it the Lambert Report. So it's an interesting document. It's one of those ones which was released by the Inquiry not that long ago. But it appears that if anybody who's read the Undercover book by Rob Evans and Paul Lewis, it is mentioned in there.
I thought it's a 60-page report.
We have read all of it. It's a report about Mike Chitty, or Mike
Predominantly,
Blake.
yeah,
mostly about him. Or Mike Blake, as he was known when he was in the animal rights movement in the early 80s.
84 to 87.
He was involved in, was it South London?
Animal Movement.
Yeah.
SLAM. Good
SLAM.
acronym.
Great acronym. Like, more good acronyms, please. You know, I was a member of CAN, Cardiff Anarchist Network. Great acronym. More of those.
BRAG. BRAG is a good one.
Battersea Redevelopment Action Group.
One of those animal rights groups that weren't particularly militant, involved in a lot of, fairly standard sort of campaigning. Certainly not the Animal Liberation Front.
For people who've been following the Inquiry and maybe the podcast, so this paper was published in 1994, but the reason why we are talking about it now is because it was actually published right at the end of the last hearings in May, and the reason for that because it mentions another guy who was deployed within that time frame, Phil Cooper, HM155, who we've talked about in passing at least before. But also we've got obviously Lambert's the author of the report. We've got Mike Chitty, as you mentioned. We've also got some other brass, DCS. I think it's Tony Waite, I'm not quite sure on that, and DCI Edmondson. I don't know much about those two. There's also another undercover, Stefan Scutt, whose cover name was Wazilowski, HN95. But if you also John Dines is in there as well. Yeah. So it's kind of like an Olympics of shitheads. The report, Olympics of of some really awful men. Basically,
it really is. I mean, it somewhat like the tradecraft manual that three of us discussed in episode 2. The language used there is like it's that internal language, their own sort of like in-jokey kind of way of talking.
Yeah, and sorry, I've also missed out one who shouldn't be forgotten. We don't know his real name. We only know him by cipher, his HN number, HN86, and he was the one, at least according to whistleblower Peter Francis, who deployed him against Stephen Lawrence's family in the family campaign. So really, quite a lovely collection of people here.
It's interesting, like kind of John Dines, for example, is talked about in the report with like quite glowingly. Like there's some real sort of
it's almost homoerotic the way he goes on. Lambert goes on about him. To be honest, it's quite just. Which is I'm absolutely fine with homoeroticism, but between those two, it's pretty revolting.
Lambert said Dines emerged from 4 years deployment in the ALF, bruised, battered and outstandingly successful. He endured the most arduous working conditions in the history of the SDS.
Yeah, he could have added, but his hair still looked good at that point.
yeah.
Yeah, not a favourite at all there of Lambert's.
Yeah, I mean, it is dripping, like so many of their internal documents, it is dripping with their own opinions.
Yeah, very similar to the undercover, the manual, the tradecraft manual. It's kind of like it's supposed to be this official document. Yeah, it's like a mixture of personal bias, anecdote, and then in this case, it's probably more so than the tradecraft manual. You get much more of the personality of the author coming over, which is like this very arrogant, self-regarding man, Bob Lambert.
He doesn't really hide his feelings towards Chitty either. It's he's got some real like choice things he says about him there, that he's sort of almost dishonest, where he's saying that he's managed to convince the psychiatrist, the police psychiatrist, that he's suffering from Stockholm syndrome, instead of actually just being sort of basically lying about his condition.
Yeah, he calls it vanity and ego, I think, instead of Stockholm syndrome, doesn't he?
Which is ironic, because basically Lambert's second guessing a qualified psychiatrist at this point.
But then he is an expert on vanity and ego.
Despite its title, the part that's been published, I suspect actually the second part, which actually was supposed to be about the animal liberation movement, never ever got written. But this part of the report is about 3 officers who, when
playing the SDS card, wasn't it? Was how they described it.
Yeah, so using their deployment to cover up their misdeeds as a police officer.
Yeah, and it seems they had plenty of them. I mean, like, they paint a picture of these characters like outside of their like field work. It's just really dysfunctional, like particularly Chitty. Like, I mean, partially, I mean, obviously that's because Bob Lambert is like not a fan of him, but like he just sounds like a complete mess of a man. Like,
yeah, well, he was. I mean, he points out in this sort of. I mean, basically, the most part of this this document is criticising Chitty for going back to the group to slam that he left, and it said he was doing that for 2 years, unbeknownst to his employers and also his wife. So when he was out of the SDS and he was. He went to, I think he was working for SO11, the security...
Criminal Intelligence Branch.
That's right. And for like when he was supposed to be at the house he was staying in or something, he used to go back and change his clothes and go back to meet up with all the people from Slam. And he carried this on for about 2 years, and neither his employers... well, how good were they at Intel? But they had no idea, and neither did his wife. And so basically, that was where the disciplinary sort of came from, was what he was doing sort of all this time.
The fact that he did this while he was still a special branch officer for 2 years and nobody noticed doesn't speak too well of them as detectives, does it?
Yeah, it goes through. I mean, the report goes through a whole sort of like wrangling by Lambert about how like. Well, if he'd have been doing his job properly and had been infiltrating like the ALF like he was meant to, then,
like I did, because I'm great. Like basically is what he's saying.
Then we would have found him out immediately. I mean, I think it's quite an illustrative section actually, because he goes on about like kind of well, the people who were infiltrating like the RCP, if they went back, they'd have to go and do this and that, but. Because these animal rights people and similarly these anarchists were just like, they're kind of quite nice people and stuff, and they would just like be friendly with you. So it was really easy to do with them.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, he described them as like well-meaning, idealistic campaigners. Typically, they'd be peace-loving, compassionate people.
Those bastards that needed infiltrating, definitely.
There's quite a lot of really annoying stuff, which is under. Lambert says about this. It's very much on a similar level to what Graham Coates, sort of like his delusion that he was actually an anarchist when he was a police officer, that there was some kind of that SDS officers had some kind of affinity with the people they were infiltrating, if they infiltrated animal rights or anarchist groups, and it's like, piss off, you're nothing like us, nothing to do with us, you've got no affinity with us whatsoever. It's just
Yeah. Then at one point he does say that where Chitty tries to convince like the I think it's the police psychiatrist that he has this affinity with them, and he holds all the animal rights views and all that sort of stuff, and then Lambert says but basically that's not the case. He's more interested in sort of the social life and the drugs. So yeah, he sort of he can't really have it. Well, he tries to have it both ways, but said that no, he didn't have no sort of affinity for the cause. It was just sort of the drugs and the lifestyle of having no responsibilities that obviously we all had at the same time. We all had in these groups that he was spying on.
And one of the other things that Lambert that's in this report is there's got some kind of line drawing. So prior to Lambert and his seems to be a HN86 joining the SDS, everything was a bit topsy-turvy, and there was all these officers who weren't really pulling their weight, and HN86 introduced these psychiatric testing, which sorted out all the problems, which obviously we now know was not true. And not least of all in respect of Lambert himself, because this is the thing about reading this report. It's basically Lambert criticising this officer, and you think, oh, hang on a second, yeah, this is the guy who not only had a relationship but fathered a child, and this is like, you know, when he's writing this, obviously this has already happened, so it's just like, I mean, hypocrisy doesn't really cover it, does it? I mean, it's just...
It's another level, isn't it, really? Yeah.
He describes this episode with Chitty as like the low point in the 25 years of the existence of the SDS. Well, that was only because I hadn't found out what you'd done, you know, Lambert. That's all. You know, I think you took over sort of quite convincingly after that.
We've had slight problems before with like kind of the talk of the officer giving his details when he got stopped for drink driving and other bits and pieces, but it's like this idea that something's totally changed, and like the wife thing, like this. Chitty didn't have his wife didn't get interviewed, and that was clearly part of the problem. They didn't vet the wife properly, and these other sort of bits and pieces that you just think like, fucking hell, Bob, you knob. Like, look what you fucking got up to, you tit.
And the other thing that Lambert is attempting, he paints himself as this amazing undercover officer, but he also politically he kind of paints himself as this like progressive liberal person. He's quite touchy-feely. He says, in fact, we need to encourage a healthy environment in which field officers feel safe to talk about the inevitable emotion ties to their target groups. Which, what we know obviously about Lambert, that's kind of, anyway.
I mean, it is. I think it's really interesting because it shows when we look at him once he came out as an academic. When he left the police, he was an academic. And you look at the way that he talked about a lot of things there, particularly around like outreach to the Muslim community in order to stop radicalisation. He's using that same sort of language, and we hear that kind of language used quite a lot by like the corporate world as like kind of just a way to excuse their fucking shitty behaviour. I think like he really was a trailblazer, Bob Lambert, for that kind of just using fucking corporate bullshit speak to cover for fucking horrendous behaviour.
To some extent, he just comes over that sort of really patronising liberal, but this time it's like an undercover police officer patronising liberal. We're not going to go into his career too much here, but we mentioned the fact that he had a relationship and fathered a child. The other thing is that he was also involved in, to date, I think the most serious miscarriage of justice, in that there was an animal rights incendiary device planted in Debenhams, and he was one of 3 people who planted the device, allegedly, I should probably say. But the other 2 people, genuine animal rights activists, are actually I think they were sentenced to 3 and 4 years respectively. So that's still in process, that court case, in terms of the appeal. But I think I just wanted to mention that in terms of him being the author of this report, which criticises other officers. Literally, he was like one of the worst ones.
And in some ways, I think when we first started discovering about the undercover policing thing, we really saw Lambert as like chief bastard, and we at first we thought he was the guy who pioneered the sort of sexual relationships as means of cover. I mean, since then we've learned about Rick Gibson and all the stuff that happened in the 1970s, but. I mean, I think we will return to Bob Lambert again and again on this podcast. I'm sure there's a great deal to be said about him, and there's a great deal he got up to. I mean, he's since. I mean, there is. We'll link to it in the show notes. But I mean, he's admitted that he was it cruel, weak, and wrong. I think was the way he described himself.
Yeah, I think I've got some other words to add to that. But I mean, it's also he. what Lambert goes on to say is that Chitty was romantically attached to a number of women in this group, and he said that it was sort of within the SDS, it was a standing joke that the South London Animal Movement was more of a dating service than a viable campaigning group. So again, to say that it was, that they didn't know about these relationships. I mean, bearing in mind, Lambert wrote this the year after my relationship with Andy Davey, who was another one deployed into the animal rights, or supposedly to spy on the Animal Liberation Front. So he would have been his manager at the time. He obviously knew all about Chitty's relationships. He'd had his own, and he was Andy's manager. So, it's getting less and less believable when they say that, the managers and that didn't know. It was clearly accepted.
Yeah, it's tongue firmly in cheek almost, isn't it? Of like kind of, oh, he had relations with more than one woman. Imagine that, Bob. Eh? More than one, eh? Imagine that.
Yeah, I think at least three, isn't there, with Bob himself? But one of the other things that he mentions as well is about where Chitty went back to the group that he'd been spying on, and he was actually seen by one of the other actual deployed undercover officers, and I think it was Coles, I think, that saw him. Andy Davey stroke Coles, who actually saw him in a restaurant. I believe it's him. The only other person it would have been was Matt Rayner, but I think I seem to remember hearing, possibly from Chitty's, the woman that he had a relationship with at the time. She was aware of Coles.
Yeah, because it sounded like it was somebody inside rather than being a remote spying thing, wasn't it? So I think they was probably tailing Robin Lane, wasn't he?
Yes, yeah, and that was I'm pretty sure that I know that Coles knew Robin Lane, so yeah, I would imagine it'd be him. But it's all one sort of very like incestuous kind of unit. I think they all seem to know each other and each other's wives, and they all go to the Christmas, or they used to go to the Christmas dance or whatever with with their wives and partners. I mean, I'd love to have been a fly on the wall for that. It'd be very awkward, wouldn't it?
I don't think these people do awkward though, do they? They don't appear to. They don't appear to, just barefacedness of the whole bloody thing.
When I've been reading through some of the reports that have come out, often the officer who are doing the surveilling of these particular meetings, they note down their own involvement in the meetings, that the fact they're interfering, making decisions, making speeches to the meetings, and you would, obviously they didn't think there was anything wrong with that, that they were totally interfering with, legitimate political activist groups, so it's just very little self-awareness of anything they were doing was wrong at all.
It's all just a big playground, right? I mean, even this is the thing with what makes this report so weird is that Lambert is kind of chastising somebody, whilst at the same time engaging in all the same things he's moaning about somebody having done, and it's just, and you get the impression because it's an internal document, who's going to read it who doesn't know what the real culture within the unit is? I mean, is it feels like something that was specifically written for one or two people to read.
Yeah, I think there's an awful lot of stuff in there that they wouldn't have, like you say, with the the tradecraft manual, it wasn't ever expected to be sort of seen by the public and by anyone sort of outside of their group, because it's pretty awful. The fact that they knew all about these, these different things that were going on, and also where Chitty is saying that he's he's got Stockholm syndrome, and he's trying to get basically sort of on the medical his medical pension, sort of, rather than getting dismissed. So, and Lambert's basically sort of canes him for that, saying that he's just devious and and like just, I mean, he comes across with all this stuff where he says that, some things that he says are quite right, some of the things that Chitty has said, and then other things he says, Lambert says that he's qualified to correct. So when he says that he was threatened, under threat of attack from Hunt supporters, and he points out that Slam didn't actually attend any hunts, and so he's saying that he's making more of it than there actually was, just basically so that he wouldn't be held like up for disciplinary and basically sacked. And I think like at the end of the report, he says that it would actually be better, for the SDS if he was sort of given, virtually like given a medical payoff, and then he would just go away and not sort of out the SDS, or play the SDS card, which he had threatened to do.
Yeah, one of the astonishing things about this is that we have three officers: Stephen Scutt, Phil Cooper, and Mike Chitty, and they basically blackmail the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police for the police pensions, and it works.
It's quite impressive, really. They've got to hand it to them for that, at least,
And you can see why they tried it on, because they knew that, as Lambert calls it in his report himself, that the golden rule is not to give the game away, to give away the SDS's operation. So given that sort of trumps everything else, then, you can use that against the, and we know from a lot of the documents that the senior police in the Met were always very worried and paranoid about this all coming out and being a terrible PR disaster. So they are, these officers, despite their various misdemeanors and more serious things, as well as fiddling expenses and drinking on duty and what have you, they were untouchable because of this great secret they held.
Yeah, that's actually how they cottoned on to Chitty's double life, was because he was putting in receipts, like vastly more expensive petrol receipts than he should have, and it transpired he was in Red Hill buying his petrol when he should have been, which is in Surrey, when he should have been in Wiltshire.
It's a bit like getting Al Capone for his taxes, isn't it? It's obviously a bit of an exaggeration, but
But they, another one of Lambert's sort of people he seems to really detest is Phil Cooper, and who he describes as selfish, arrogant, disloyal both professionally and domestically. Has no redeeming features in this officer.
He was the one, according to Lambert's report, that gave Chitty advice on how to basically blackmail the Met.
Yeah, so when Chitty sort of disappeared, I think after things weren't going his way, and he disappeared for a week and not telling his wife, which causing her great distress, which Lambert seemed very concerned about. Not obviously mentioning his own wife's distress, but he and it was they discovered that he'd gone to see Phil Cooper and was getting some advice. But he describes, I think it's actually HM155, he describes as the lowest point in the history of the SDS.
That's right, yeah. Lambert also describes a visit that he and another officer made to Chitty in a pub. Obviously, everyone met in pubs all the time then. But basically, they got thrown out because of Chitty's bad language. The landlord threw them out, which is quite funny. Sounds quite funny.
Yeah, but he was slagging off a senior officer, wasn't he?
Oh yeah,
Was it Harper?
Yeah, that's right. Superintendent Harper. That's
yeah,
right.
we really had it in for him. Was like he was shouting profanities about him so loud that the landlord got him chucked out. Brilliant.
Yeah. Lambert describes visiting him as hazardous. One of the weird little things about Chitty was actually mentioned in the undercover book. Is that Chitty was a racing driver, but for some reason he chose to be this racing driver under his cover name, and there's a photo of him with Chris Rea.
Yeah, he'd won some. I don't.
Brands Hatch.
I don't really understand the world of motor racing. I'll be honest, but I'm guessing it's quite low down on the whole kind of the CC or whatever the hell they sort of do it. So I don't know what he was racing, but apparently, like he was known by his the Blake surname as a racing driver as well, and he was sharing photos. I mean, it just seems just like an absolutely mental. I don't know, a really weird thing. I didn't quite. I mean, I couldn't quite understand if like what wasn't really come across was, did this like secondary persona he had as a racing driver, did that predate him being an undercover officer, or did he start afterwards? Because I mean, he hadn't been in the force that long. And it was one of the things that Lambert points out, is that he hadn't been in the branch for very long. He'd previously been in Bermuda Police and had done some other private sector role, which is redacted, which had given him the right sort of experience for the job.
I think 5 years, like monitoring private phone calls. I think that sort of was.
In Bermuda, that's quite interesting in the sense that it links up with the podcast before last. We spoke to Donald about how widespread the surveillance was, because basically Chitty's job was to listen to phone calls in Bermuda, and then he went on to another job within a special branch. It sounds like he was in the control room, but it seemed like maybe he went back to listening to phone calls then as well. Interesting facts about Bermuda for people who not from Bermuda is that it's one of the few left British overseas territories left, but back in the 1970s, I think its prime minister or president was assassinated by a Black Power activist.
When Chitty was being interviewed for the job, according to Lambert, he didn't know it was to be an undercover officer. He thought it was going to be listening to phone calls again.
I mean, the whole thing about much of the evidence that we hear in the inquiry, the published stuff, it's like, to say they're unreliable narrators is underestimating just how how much we distrust what they're saying. But that's what we've got. We have to sift through their evidence.
Yeah, I think as well, it's like it shows that, like, as much as that, because one level they're being dishonest to the people they're spying on, but that's kind of a given. That's their job. In the course of their deployment, they're being dishonest to their wives because of what they're getting up to, and then it appears they're being dishonest with each other. And then when they write up about how they're being dishonest with each other, the person who's writing it is being completely dishonest about his own role at the same time. I mean, like, there's so many layers of lies and bullshit. It's like, you can understand why people wonder what the truth is anymore.
Well, there's another layer of being a bullshit, is that Lambert, as Evans and Lewis say in their book, that he befriended Chitty and pretended to be his friend to sort of get all this information out of him, So.
Yeah, it's like literally like there's no fraternity there really. He talks about the kind of the family of the SDS a few times, but he also shows that they're quite willing to fuck each other over if need be.
So he mentions at one point where where Chitty's wife confided in Lambert. So like obviously, he's gone. There's a bit of work been done sort of there. So obviously she must have been like interviewed before he wrote this report, because at times she said there was nobody she could talk to when she was worried about sort of Chitty's lack of interest in their home life after his deployment and stuff, and she felt there was no one to confide in. And then later on he says, she confided in Lambert. Obviously he's such a great people person.
One of the things I find a bit amusing is that after his deployment, a little bit after actually, he went into a close protection bodyguarding role for 2 years. I mean, most of the people they protect, I wouldn't, I just wouldn't want to be under his care for sure. I mean, he sounded like he wouldn't be all that great at looking after your life. If there's somebody he was, if you wanted to nominate someone to protect your body from, you wouldn't pick him, I don't think.
I mean, it does show a lot about the way in which the officers are moved around Special Branch. It's like, oh yeah, you're on the undercover unit. Oh, well, we moved over to like listening to people. Well, that kind of makes sense. And then it's like, oh, and then there's just like naturalizing and checking people at ports, and then like and being a close bodyguard to like minor royals and celebrities and stuff. It's just a really weird unit in lots of ways, isn't it?
And it is weird because we mentioned the mileage thing already, but it is weird. I mean, this is the thing that they found that he was doing that was wrong, because you can imagine the state that he sounded like he was in. He would have been quite obviously crap at whatever job he was supposed to be doing, let alone a bodyguard.
I mean, I think that it does show as well, like, we've heard it in the inquiry enough. It's just that actually it's that part of things. It's the expenses, it's the overtime hours, it's the flat they've been allocated. It's all those kind of issues which are really kind of like they're at the forefront of the minds of the senior officers within the unit. That's the kind of that's the real stuff. Which like obviously it's like everybody turns up on a Monday because you had to put your hours in then, so everybody would be there then. And all this kind of is that world which obviously takes precedence to them to anything else that's going on.
Yeah, like so kind of poorly run at times as well, because it says Lambert mentions like in 2 separate occasions, 2 of the undercover officers failed to stick to one of the sort of the cardinal rules, which is like is not to compromise their identity or compromise the operation, and like for both of the officers were done sort of for the same thing, as they were both stopped for drink driving, and both like revealed their identities, their real identities to the officers that had stopped them. And in fact, one of the officers actually had like documents on him in his true identity. So it was a bit of a tin pot operation from start to finish. But also say another point is that didn't stop then, because Alison found Mark Cassidy, her partner's real name of Mark Jenner on a credit card in his pocket. So it's one of these things that they don't ever seem to have learned, or to have got past this sort of this amateur hour, I suppose.
And it's telling that, like, when we heard during the last section of the inquiry about like what Rick Gibson has got up to in terms of having relationships and compromising himself in various ways, was well known throughout Special Branch, not just the SDS. So like they knew that like kind of that bad, like kind of badly done, badly behaved, I don't know how to sort of place it, but like unprofessionalism, I guess, was a problem from like at least then, which is it's a good 10 years before this report's written, and like you get this impression that like, oh yeah, there's this problem, there's that problem, but anyway, we'll just carry on regardless.
In the conclusion of this, chapter 7 of the Lambert report, a final word about the Harrys. Lambert says the majority returned to normal duties within Special Branch without fuss or favour, enlightened if not necessarily enriched by the undercover experience. A significant minority leave the police service to pursue invariably successful careers in areas that offer personal challenge. Making passing reference to our 2 most recent departures, here we go with the Dines bit. Who would dare argue against John Dines becoming a successful first-rate lawyer? The same determination and creativity that stood him in good stead on the SDS will serve them well as they carve out rewarding new careers. Anyway.
It's insane. I mean, like, he goes on to say that, that like in 25 years, they've only, of 80 undercover officers, only 4 have tarnished the unit. And it's like, apart from, like, well, he himself obviously isn't included in those 4. It's incredibly... It's like another layer of deceit. I mean, like, they weren't even being honest with each other. Like, not only were they not being honest with the people that they were infiltrating, they weren't being honed with each other.
Yeah, I mean, they'd already had, was it Jim Pickford as well? He'd already kind of had a child at that point with another, with one of the women he was spying on. But yeah, there's just... just glossing over sort of all of these other things that, that we now know. It's, he must have been sort of laughing behind his hand as he was writing this rubbish.
But what's weird is that it's not only that we know it, but also we have heard that it was common gossip within the unit. So, like, who is this report written for? Who would read this report and think it was honest? I mean, where is it going to go? It's
to the commissioner, isn't it?
Right, exactly, right. So it's like literally like... the only people, it's an internal document, and anybody who's got access to it, apart from the very senior brass, are going to know it's a load of bullshit. And will have known it's bullshit for a long time. There's a bit in there where he's talking about how like Chitty is convincing, like he managed to convince senior officers that he was doing useful work when anybody who was actually in the animal rights movement would know that he wasn't. And it's like, well, that goes for the whole bloody unit. Like it's all this like you're selling, and this document itself is part of selling a lie about what the unit gets up to senior management.
Yeah, I'd love to know what these like, the huge successes that the other the other officers have got. I mean, there's like Chris said, there's there was the incendiary devices that got the two activists jailed, and also then sort of it would have been around this time, around sort of 94, that Matt Rayner, I would say framed, but sort of convinced one of those same activists to purchase a shotgun, and and then of course it was that appeared to be, I think that was quite an amusing thing amongst the SDS, is that sort of Lambert had got him jailed the first time, and then he was set up again by Rayner and did another long prison sentence.
Lambert very much seems to say that what happened before in the SDS, before him and good old HN86 joined, it was all a bit of a shambles, and the deployments were all a bit random. But from his time onwards, it was all brilliant, and they only deployed officers to detect serious criminality, and and the such like. But obviously, we know right up to the, if you like, the end of the MPIOU that that wasn't the case. Lynn Watson's deployment within the clowns, the clown army, is obviously the most absurd example of that in terms of like deploying undercovers to non-threatening groups. But so yeah, he says it. He says it quite a few times in the report.
Mm.
Yeah, Lambert also, he said that in one of these things where he claims that Chitty wasn't telling the truth, he says where Chitty implies that he was involved in making or planting of incendiary devices, and Lambert was keen to explain that Chitty was at the shallow end of the animal rights pool. So basically, it's a bit of a sort of like, he didn't do that. He was he was in the shallow end, whereas Lambert himself was obviously a deep swimmer. It's kind of smacks of like, no, he didn't do it, but I did.
I can plant incendiary devices. Do you want me to show you how? He doesn't say that, but
Yeah, it's all part of that. It's just like, it's all sales patter. I mean, like, he moans about like Chitty's sales patter, but this bloody document's a bunch of sales patter.
Yeah, it's another one of the amusing things that Chitty did was after his I think this was whilst he was like on his 2-year sick leave, waiting to hear the outcome of the disciplinary against him, is that he was arrested for using an invalidated travel pass, because he because he had no warrant card, and in the end he told the transport police that he was he was working undercover, and he was eventually released, and Lambert was sent in to smooth over amongst sort of the locals who'd made the local police who'd made a complaint against him, and he was sent in to smooth over this complaint they'd made about Chitty's abusive behaviour.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I suppose that when we look over the history from 68 onwards is that they did have quite good coverage, but it was kind of all of left-wing groups, etc. I mean, it was quite random in some such they, for instance, in the bigger organisations like the SWP, which branch they ended up, it was very much happenstance, but they did cover a lot of ground. But it seems to be more by accident than design, in the sense that the British left, in its broadest sense, was quite small. So even with their crap sort of organisation skills, they still managed somehow to report on most of it. But it was more by, as I say, yeah. I mean, I
think partially it's that scattergun effect they had of just sending out officers to areas and going like, just find something to, just join something, particularly early on. And I mean, as time goes on, you get this sense that though they maybe selected targets a bit more, that in reality it was just like kind of get out there and get involved in something. And if they send out enough officers, then they'll do fairly decent coverage.
one of the things that Lambert specifically mentions is that Chitty was quite good at, putting in well-written reports, but he says those, he never reported any sort of criminality or anything like that. But from what we've read of the reports from 68 to 82, I would say 99% of them have no sort of criminality in at all. They're organisational meetings on the whole. I mean, there are reports of demos, etc. as well. But, for Lambert to criticise Chitty in that respect is like criticising, he should be criticising the SDS operations for the previous 30 years,
I mean, which goes back to my point about like who's it written for. I mean, it's got to be for somebody who's security clearance to know about it, but also has no knowledge of what this SDS has been like for the last 25 years at that point. This document only makes sense if you read it in isolation. If you've got a working knowledge of the unit generally, then it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, if you know who Bob Lambert is, it also doesn't make any sense.
Right, yeah.
So it's actually interesting because they sort of one of the few things that I've seen, about the sort of the far right groups is he explains sort of when he's saying about why Chitty would want to go back, and basically he said, it's the sort of the cosy world of middle class animal rights and the soft activists of no real interests to the police. But then he mentions. He said that some of the undercovers that were deployed into right-wing groups, he said they have no desire amongst the undercover officers in right-wing groups to return. And he said that they feel occasional extreme antipathy towards their undercover associates, as the right-wing is often violent, crude and bigoted. So basically, it was... we're just a lot nicer people, as animal rights and anarchists and stuff. It said, it's they have to, the officers had to have sort of like some psychological help to help them break the bond with these people that they made like close, strong friendships with whilst they were undercover.
Again, that speaks to Lambert's delusional picture of himself, this like progressive right-on liberal thinker.
But also it is that like, it turns out we're great. Turns out our culture and our the kind of the scene, if you like, is actually all right. We're nice people, unlike all these other fuckers.
Yeah. I can see what the issue would be, but and also, but sort of to bear in mind, Bob Lambert left his his 2-year-old son that he had with the activist to go back to his normal life. And, that's, anyone that's had kids, it's just can't fathom how someone can do that. So, it's where some of these other officers, forged strong bonds of friendship and that, he just, doesn't seem to, even with his own son, doesn't seem to have, that to have been a problem. So he just upped and left.
It's just like the whole thing is just a really prime example of cognitive dissonance. If you send this to a shrink, it's like this guy, when you told him what this guy was, and then read this, it's like, how could you write this? Well, this is so delusional. Delusional, I suppose, is the word, isn't it? There's a couple one of the other things about Lambert is he makes several literary allusions in the paper that, also quite pretentious. Well, he starts off actually with a reference to Celluloid Heroes by the Kinks, goes straight into Dickens and Mr. Micawber, and then we have like literally, it's like all within a couple of paragraphs. It's just like overdoing it somewhat, mate. Come on. Yeah, you can read books, we get it.
Yeah, and don't forget quoting Oscar Wilde as well.
Oscar Wilde, you're this lefty intelliger, you just happen to end up in the police, whatever, mate.
Yeah, not a pretentious tosser at all. No, but one of his better phrases said that when he was talking about Chitty not actually being attached to his group of animal rights people and the cause, it was more about his predilection for cannabis, a carefree lifestyle, heavy rock music, and laid-back women.
Laid-back women, yeah.
Laid-back women.
But he also says he's a bit of a trivial point. He was into this psych rock band called Man.
Yeah, that was actually interesting. That so like listeners from South Wales who might know me would know Man. Shout out to Clint Iguana, who was a huge Man fan. He made a thing of being like, as part of his persona, he was a Man follower. And we found this as well with Marco Jacobs later on. He was like this big fan of a number of like quite obscure kind of heavy metal bands. But he became this follower of man under his false name, under the Michael Blake name, the same as he'd been this racing car driver. So he created this persona, which obviously like when he continued to go to Man gigs. He obviously liked Man. Check out Man actually. They're quite sadly the main guy's dead now, but interesting blokes, like kind of quite hard psychedelic.
There's quite a few of the Undercovers had favourite bands, which they probably generally included that as part of their persona.
Well, I mean, like Vince Miller, when he was said to him that part of his persona was being a fan of West Coast, West Coast music, West Coast rock music, whatever it's bloody called, and he went, "No, I genuinely am an aficionado." It's like, sorry, mate, didn't mean to diss your fucking musical taste, like in this fucking thing about you being a fucking rapist.
And can I just at this point it's pertinent to say that the only thing I ever heard Andy listen to in the van was Right Said Fred. I think that says it all, doesn't it? Really.
Fucking hell, Right Said Fred. I mean, like, interestingly now, conspiraloon nutters about COVID, aren't they?
Are they? Oh, God.
Yeah, incredibly active on. I think they might have got banned from Twitter now because the amount of madness they've come out with. Yeah. So Andy David, they may be one of the least cool when it came to the musical fucking interest.
Yeah, turned up jeans.
So, I mean, like, if you are looking to understand the psyche of the undercover police, this document may not be the place to start. But if you're looking to see what a weird, twisted, once you know who these characters are, reading this document will give you an idea of like how dysfunctional the unit was.
Yeah, there was one sort of nugget of sort of police nerdery in it, where it mentions, in chapter 3, it says when he's talking about Chitty completing his SDS tour of duty, his specialism in covert operations, working first on S Squad, Unit 2, and then at Putney. So he moved to this section, SO11, which at that point was called the Special Intelligence Section, SIS, which is also the same acronym for MI5, confusingly. So part of his duties was in this squad, which went on to run the FIT squads, the people that used to harass activists back in the sort of late 90s.
The forward intelligence teams.
Forward intelligence teams, FIT teams, yeah. So, and that's interesting because it seemed from the implication there is that they also run some kind of electronic surveillance thing, which we kind of got. This is what we thought that did happen. But it's interesting that actually that's a nugget of information I don't think we had confirmed before.
I think it's interesting actually because I think FIT, the forward intelligence teams, and then the response to them, FIT Watch, I think was the first sort of activist, sort of anti, political policing campaign that really kind of got under the skin of the police. If anybody remembers back in the sort of late 2000s, or mid to late 2000s, FIT watchers, taking banners, putting them in the way of the police cameras and stuff, and so essentially, like, ended up the unit was just it became such a thing to like kind of harass and get in the way of the forward intelligence teams that they got rid of the unit. I think we see a similar thing now with the police liaison officers, the PLOs, those light blue bibs. We've seen some fantastic work by Spelling Mistakes Cost Lives with the signs that don't talk to these people, with a big sign kind of following them around on demos. I really encourage, because so much of like kind of resisting repression of political movements it's partly about the covert surveillance, but it's also about the overt intimidation and the overt like intelligence gathering that sections like the forward intelligence teams and the police liaison officers now do. Like kind of if you are going to a demonstration, you see those officers, encourage people not to speak to them. If you can get one of those banners, you can download the artwork from Spelling Mistakes Cost Lives, print them out, just stand there with a placard next to them. Do not talk to these officers. They are there to find out information about you. And I remember when the forward intelligence teams, when I first personally had interactions with them, I discovered that like the information they discovered about me there was probably information that was used to aid the deployment of undercover police officers into my life. So these units were obviously passed intelligence between each other, and it's the overt policing that gives them that information in order to be able to use an undercover officer in people's lives. So I mean, like an interesting little document in many ways, like mad in lots of others. Certainly, like I'm not. It is redacted in places, but it's a lot less redacted than a lot of the other documents we've had released to us. According to the inquiry, that's because it was very clear that it had been referred to heavily by Rob Evans and Paul Lewis in their book, and that they hadn't broken the Official Secrets Act. So it's almost like, it would be childish for us to redact it now.
Although it was I don't know if you remember, in some part of the preliminary hearings of the inquiry, there was some kind of restriction order issued aimed at journalists not to release any more details of the document. Do you remember that?
Yeah, there was. Yeah. It was very much one of those, like, beyond that, like, they've already published the book, John. Like, there's no need, like, any kind of, like, whatever they wanted to get out of that document. They obviously were advised by lawyers not to release certain parts of it. The parts of it that they did want, they've already done. It's just that kind of ridiculous way that the inquiry is trying desperately to control things that it has no control over. So we will return to Bob Lambert again. We'll return to all this cast of fuckwit characters. We will definitely return to Bob a lot in the future. Like if there's anybody else has read this and has kind of thinks they've spotted something we haven't mentioned, please do get in touch.
Yeah, there's one thing that that stood out to me, and it was where Lambert suggested that he himself and DCI Edmondson, who had recently taken over the SDS, should be allowed to access and view comments of doctors assessing Chitty, and also for the psychiatrist assessing Chitty to have some objective background information of the case rather than just the sole account of Chitty himself. So basically, Chitty's a liar and can't be trusted, and so Lambert needs to give his own version to the psychiatrist making a judgment on his mental state.
It's amazing, really, how much Bob Lambert thinks he's so fucking great. That he's like, what you need is someone objective and honest, like me, for example. Well, thanks for joining us. We will return again next week. If you want to find out more about this topic or listen to any of our previous episodes, check out spycops.info. If you're able to give us a review on any podcasting platform you listen to this on, or if you're using Apple Podcasts particularly, please give us a 5-star review there. It means a huge amount to our visibility. Maybe next episode we'll start reading out some of the reviews, but so please leave a written one, and if there's anything you want us to say, you can leave it in there. We will read it out.
Do we want to do a little bit on the update that came out about the next hearings, etc.?
Oh yeah, so it would appear that the next phase 3 of tranche 1 of the undercover policing inquiry will start now on the 9th of May 2022. So that would be the end. That's the final part of the first tranche. We'll mark it'll be 2 to 3 weeks. Then theoretically the inquiry will move on to tranche 2, which is the next time period. If the inquiry continues at the same pace it has so far, we'd be looking for a report in about 2037. Now the inquiry has claimed that future tranches will be quicker. That they've learnt how to do it through this phase. I would point out that given that so much, the thing which takes so long, according to the inquiry, is the processing of disclosure and the fact that there are 6 steps to the checking of documents before they're released to participants. Given that there's so little of it from the 1970s has survived, and there's liable to be a great deal more disclosure in the later sections, I'm not entirely convinced that the later tranches will pass that much smoother and that much quicker. But supposedly, we'd be looking. They're hopeful for like a 2027 sort of conclusion. But who knows?
Yeah, I think to date the longest public inquiry is the Bloody Sunday inquiry of 13 years, and I think we're definitely going to get second place.
Oh, at least we're going for a silver medal for sure. I believe in John Mitting. I think you can do it. Go for gold, John. It can take longer. I believe in you.